With a vase of mixed flowers, probably the most important thing is to capture a sense that we don't just have a bowl of generic blooms here, but we actually have different types of flowers. And we also want to capture something of the feel of the flowers, of their shape, their curl, their curve, their lightness. When I have a subject such as this, I find it most helpful to start by just drawing the blooms. And I start with whichever bloom isn't interrupted in its line work by any other bloom, if that's possible. And I position that one. So you can see me, I'm choosing the one at, say, 10 o'clock on the clock. And you may have noticed I did a series of dots around the circumference of the flower. And this is usually how I start flowers such as this that are a fairly significant feature, to make sure that I'm not tempted or carelessly make all the petals the same length, that I allow for the fact that in a 3/4 view of a flower such as this, some of the petals are going to be coming more straight at us and therefore will be severely foreshortened. But others will be looking down on and more see them on their full length, and they will be longer. And exactly how this works out will depend on the overall angle we're viewing the flower and on the type of petal. But I find that by putting some positioning marks, I far more easily keep the overall shape of the flower in proportion. I don't end up with one side where the petals look disproportionately long compared to the other. So here we have a daisy. So it was a cosmos flower, the first one I drew, and now we have a daisy. And then we have some azaleas, and there is a cornflower right at the back, but it's so hidden by another bloom. I actually left it out because I thought it would just look cluttering and perhaps a bit difficult to even work out what was happening there if I put it in, particularly without the colour to indicate that it was a different flower. So now I have the azalea flower, and this is a bit different from the more daisy-like ones I've drawn so far. And the key part to have a sense of is this throat that has that shadow in it and has the stamens coming out of it. And what I want to get here is a sense of the ruffled edge. The ruffled edge and the approximately conical shape that moves back from us. And again, I do some dots and marks to try and indicate where I'm going to go. I don't place them as well as I could have, but that's still helpful because it's still a mark for me to position off as I draw. And they're the sort of marks that really aren't going to be noticed at all at the end. And then I add this hatching for the throat of the flower, and I think it looks okay now. But at the end of the drawing, when I'd finished everything, I think it was too dark, and it would have been better if I'd kept a lighter touch with it. What I should have done, I'm using a 0.2 millimeter pen here. I should have switched to a 0.1 millimeter pen so that I could establish a much lighter feel to that hatching. Because these are, particularly because of their colour, but also their thickness, probably the most delicate flowers, even though they're probably the largest ones as well. And I have another one here where the throat is more pointed in the direction of the light source, and so it's not particularly in shade. And so now I've got a couple of sprays of leaves which are fairly important to do because they're now closer than the flowers behind. But you'll notice that I'm drawing the blooms. I'm not drawing the stems at this point unless it's important or the stems are in the front. Because what I find is if we draw the stems first, it can be difficult then to position the blooms on the end of the stem. It's easy for the stem not to be angled quite right. And then the flower, if we position the flower correctly for the reference, often doesn't look like it's very realistically growing from the stem. So I find that by doing the flower first, we can then attach the stem, get a sense of where it needs to go, and have an angle that looks quite realistic for the angle of the bloom. And so now I'm moving back to this one that's fairly edge on, this daisy that's fairly edge on, having just drawn a cosmos now just behind those leaves I did. Again, that is fairly edge on. And this is where we need to look carefully at the shapes and not think of a flower, certainly not think of a daisy, or else we're just going to start to draw cartoons. And we have to look at the shape, the two-dimensional shape, to actually just see the edges and look at the width between the edges and draw the best representation of that we can. And work hard at accuracy in proportions. And if we do that, we will end up with a foreshortened flower. You'll also notice when I do the center of these daisy type flowers that I don't draw a circle. I resist the urge to do that, and I do again a series of dotted lines. And that lets me create a more realistic effect, because it's always about capturing the effect of what we're seeing. And the effect of those centers of these daisies in real life is not a circle, it's not a hard edge. It's a finely ruffled edge of the silhouette of all these little stamen of all these little stamens that will produce the seeds eventually. So now I go to the other side of the vase and I do the spray of leaves that comes out there. And I'm doing this now because I do intend to draw the vase, and therefore I want the full width because I want to make sure that the vase looks balanced in the center under the flowers, because it is a fairly balanced arrangement. And so now there are some more leaves here. These are azalea leaves, so they go with the trumpet type flowers, and I'm putting them in. And there are a few buds that are actually cornflower buds that go with that blue flower at the back, which I'm not going to draw. But I put the buds in because they add a bit of interest and a bit of variety and still, and a sense of realism, and they certainly blend in with everything else, but just in a way that gives a bit of variety to what we've been drawn. So here comes one of the buds. Actually the high point of the display. So these flowers the flowers themselves took me about 20 minutes to draw, and maybe a bit more, maybe about 24 minutes, I think. And then the vase took 3 or 4 minutes after that. So you're watching this double time. So if you halve it, you can see the real time. And of course you can use that cog icon that you can see on your screen to speed up or slow down what's happening. And if you don't speed up or slow down too much, the dialogue is still quite understandable. Now, that line I just did that was meant to indicate to me where the vase was coming was a better line than the one I made earlier that was coming off the end of the petal. I just didn't really observe carefully enough. And again, this is where careful observation over and over again is shown to often take more than a quick look. And when I first began to establish where the vase was, I just didn't line it up with the flowers carefully enough. So having put the vase in with a rather heavy-handed line at the bottom, which I'm hoping will be disguised when I do a bit more work on the vase, I'd now just work at getting the infill of the stems that I haven't drawn and take advantage of the fact that there's some shadows behind these, particularly that lowest daisy, that bring the petals into greater contrast. So I want to add that, even if I don't know what it is that I'm drawing behind. I want to take opportunity of the contrast there. And at this point, I am wondering whether to try and draw the stems that are all squiggly, from the refraction of the vase and the pattern on the vase, or whether to just leave it looking like this as if it's a china vase that we can't see through. And probably, I think it would have looked better at the end if I'd left it as it is now. But I don't like leaving things just because they could be difficult to draw, because we don't progress our skills this way. And I've never particularly drawn the bottom half of a vase that we can see through before. Not one that wasn't just straightforward, some long straight stems in a smooth sided vase, but this vase has got some ripples in the sides that provide a lot of distortion. But before I do that, I add some hatch in lines just to create a slightly more realistic sense, and particularly for the leaves that have their backs to us but away from the light, which therefore are in shade. So I'm thinking that looks okay. So will I move on with the vase? And I decide to do that. But fortunately, before I do that, I switch pens, and I switch from my 0.2 to a 0.1 millimeter pen. Or I thought I did. So now I certainly have got the 0.1 here. And so I give a sense of the ridges that spiral around the vase without wanting to do a hard line, because although they're discernible, they're not sharp edges. And then there is this distorted ripple to virtually every stem that's in the vase. And it is the sort of thing which in a line drawing can end up looking a bit either out of place or just perhaps not matching up with how the line work looks above. And I think the biggest problem I ended up having with it was when I thought, well, I can hatch around the top of the vase, particularly on the left-hand side where it's shaded from the light, and that will help provide some contrast. But it finished up being as dark as the shadow that I'd done in that lowest bloom, that lowest azalea, the one that I said I wished I'd done lighter. And because of that, it kind of links the shadow in the throat of the azalea with the shadow on the vase as if it's the same object, and therefore I think it becomes confusing. Instead of helping to see that azalea bloom more clearly and more easily, I think it actually confuses, because we're not sure whether the darkness within the bloom and the darkness around the bloom link, in which case, what is that saying? These are the things that we learn, and these are the things that make it a good reason to do these fairly short, quick drawings. Half-hour drawing for me, almost, this one. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you have a go drawing it, because flowers are actually great things for careful observation. And we need careful observation if we're going to resist having cartoon-like flowers, or just have all the flowers look the same and all look as though they're from the same angle. And you'll find this photo, of course, on my channel community page. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.